Good morning. I'm sure there may be some other folks joining us, but I've been pondering two questions this week. I was joking about the fact that when I was teaching during as a full-time profession, my head was always in that. Like I was like, that's what I was thinking about all week long. It seemed like. I haven't quite shaken that. So then during this week, I've been kind of rolling back around a couple of questions related to our conversation. The first is, if indeed modern nations are bound together by kind of like a belief that we share certain commitment to certain ideas in common, then it seems like the most natural place, in the American experience, the most natural place you'd find those ideas would be in the Declaration and in the Constitution, especially in the Bill of Rights. Although I thought about that, I wonder how many Americans could summarize all 10 of the Bill of Rights. And I think the percentage would be pretty low that got past like 4 or 5, frankly. I had to look because a lot of them are about like right to a trial and that kind of stuff. But that seems like, okay, if that's the case, then it seems like those would be the ideas. Yeah. If you ascribe to a belief in these ideas, if you endorse these ideas, you're an American. But in times of stress throughout our history, times of war, times of kind of cultural disruption, that hasn't been enough. There've been a conversation that's like, no, we're not sure that you're as American as the rest of us. Or we're sure that we're more American than the rest of you, without regard to the Declaration and the Bill of Rights, right? So I'm curious I've been pondering, like, why is that? So this is a question I'd like to kind of come back to in the second half of our time together this morning. Like, why is that in times of stress, that doesn't seem to be enough? And the second question is much more closely related to my discipleship to Jesus. And that is, why is it that Christians in America seem particularly prone, in those times of stress, to conflate their Christian identity and an American identity, and to fall back onto this notion, which is really a complicated question, about whether or not America is in some way Christian. Like, what is it about the American experience or about our discipleship that leaves us prone to that tendency? Because I think it is fair to say we do, at least a lot of Christians in America have that tendency. So, but before we get to those two questions, I guess, Brenda, I just want to make sure that people know that they are still coming in.
Yeah, they can see it through there.
Okay.
That's good.
Okay.
I want us to still have some air too.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
I think that's good. So, but before we get to that, I wanted to kind of tell you the story a little bit about the centennial. Some of you remember the bicentennial. We're now, I don't know, I forget the word for the 250th. It's something too long to remember. But anyway, the centennial in 1876 is another interesting moment, in part because it comes out of the Civil War. And if there was ever a time when it was really difficult for Americans to hold on to a belief in a historical providence, remember historical providentialism, this is what the historian Nicholas Guyot argues, is not only that God judges nations, but God raises up certain nations to do his bidding, to do God's will in the world. And that was really strong in the founding of the United States. It maintained that belief through manifest destiny as it was articulated in the early 19th century up to the Civil War. But the Civil War, both the Union and the Confederacy claimed that they were doing God's will. They were doing God's work. So you can imagine where that puts a real stress on this notion that we are a nation set apart to do the work of God in the world. It's like, well, if we're that nation, then how come the Confederacy can claim that they're that nation? And so it led some people to abandon that historical providentialism altogether and said, no, we're going to fall back on to what Guyot calls judicial providentialism, that God judges nations. And he is judging us now through this great Civil War. And you can hear Lincoln kind of moving. If you go to the speeches of Abraham Lincoln, you see him kind of negotiating that terrain. Like, is this the providential work of God in this kind of purifying moment? Or is this simply God's judgment on us? Crucial is that the declension, the falling away from kind of the promise that God is blessing us, was not defined as racism. It was defined as the institution of slavery. Okay. Crucial. I think that's really crucial, because then it's like, if we get rid of slavery, then we'll be the nation we're meant to be. And they leave unaddressed the status of freed black Americans. Right? Are you ready to embrace a multiracial, multi-ethnic nation? Right? Is that the promise? Right? So for a lot of, even the most radical abolitionists, very few of even the most radical abolitionists articulated the promise of America as a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. Do you see the difference? If you say that, if that's the promise, then the falling away is we're racist. We quit being racist, then we can be the nation we're meant to be. But if the promise is we were meant to be a land of liberty, a land of freedom, we've allowed slavery to exist in our midst. If we get rid of slavery, then we'll be the nation, we'll be God's nation again. Okay. That leaves unaddressed, the second form leaves unaddressed the status of black people post-slavery. And if you come out to the West, the status of Mexican Americans who get absorbed into the United States when, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they don't come to the United States comes to them. Right? I remember there's a Mexican American comic who said, what part of Mexico are your ancestors from? He says, Burbank. And that, another writer I read who was talking about her family living in, I think it was Albuquerque. Her family has been in Albuquerque for generations and generations, for centuries. And they've been, by staying in the same place, Spanish, Mexican, and Americans. Right? So they don't even address that, not much less indigenous people. But because they don't address the status of black Americans, they're kind of left out there hanging. And so the prophecy doesn't include a kind of like a multiracial, that was a very bad pun. That does not include a kind of a multiracial democracy. And so there are historians then who have looked at this and said, so how does the North and South reconcile after the Civil War? And really that question is, how do white Northerners and white Southerners reconcile after the Civil War? And in many ways, they do it at the expense of the full citizenship rights of black Americans. There's a writer, I'd have to look up the exact name, but there's the writer who first publishes a book that's called The Lost Cause, and starts rephrasing the secession as a lost cause, that they failed in execution, but their motives were somehow laudatory. Because their motives were to kind of self-determination, preservation of a local way of life, which are kind of these deeply embedded American kind of values. But this doesn't address the oligarchs, I think we'd call them today, plantation owners who did not have anybody's best interest at heart except their own. And so it kind of blurs, we kind of mute that strain of what the Civil War was about. And we kind of elevate, well, their motives were pure. And because their motives were pure and the Northern motives were pure, we can reconcile. But they reconcile in a way that leaves no space for the full citizenship rights of Black Americans, especially because that is left to the states. And at the end of the Reconstruction, the federal government kind of withdraws from the South, and states are allowed to kind of let Jim Crow laws settle in and greatly compromise. And I think it's largely because the promise is never articulated as we were meant to be a multiracial democracy. And this is why, although I went back and forth when the pastors suggested this, went back and forth at least in my own mind, I didn't challenge them because it was their decision, to call this the landscape of the white Christian nationalism. Right? In the 19th century, that white part of it nobody even defends it because it's just assumed. But it really comes into play following the Civil War, where this becomes very much a construction of a white nation, and they just don't know what to do with it's a white nation that doesn't know what to do with its Black population, even after that Black population is no longer enslaved.
But didn't the Constitution of the Southern states, didn't it very specifically say that this is all about slavery and maintaining slavery? Yeah,
it's I'm not sure if it's in the Constitution of the Confederacy, but it's clearly this is a major part of what they're fighting to preserve, is an economic system that the leaders of the Confederacy had no articulated desire to end it, right? And so it was going to perpetuate it. And then it became the question of, is it going to extend anyplace else? Because the nation's expanding at this point, and that becomes how Kansas will come into the Union, how California will come into the Union, in those time periods. Yeah, and here's what I found really interesting is even some leading abolitionist voices, including Abraham Lincoln at certain points in his career, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, advocate for the removal of the Black population from the United States, either back to Africa, or there are some attempts to negotiate an agreement with some South American country to establish a colony there for African Americans who would remove from the United States after slavery. So, and again, I think it's this hard to imagine this world, and I try not to be too hard on these folks, frankly, because they'd be imagining something that had never existed before in human history. It's one thing to have self-rule when you have some kind of shared ethnicity, shared racial identification, but to have that in a multiracial situation is really unusual. But this is then where you really get the whiteness kind of into this, and this then becomes white and Christian is really the heart of the nation. Right? And that's where you get the work of the Klan, which is very active in Methodist churches and in Baptist churches and in churches throughout the South. I mean, these are church-going folks who are riding around as I think we would call today terrorists in white hoods, taking the law into their own hands.
Totally terrorism.
Yeah.
Isn't there like a kind of a back and forth here? Because at the time of the 14th Amendment, white people are made specifically citizens. And their reconstruction involves a lot of black people in Congress, this, that, and the other. And then as time goes on, there's the reaction to that. And so it kind of goes back and forth.
Yeah. And what goes back and forth is whether the federal government is willing to intervene in state government and force adherence to the Constitution. And when they're no longer willing to do that, states are allowed to kind of write their own rules, and that's where you have this kind of reconciliation. One of the most interesting places for me, again, because my background is the study of American literature, is what's called kind of a plantation culture that develops really in the 1890s, where that really rewrites the slave experience and makes the argument that slaves were happy, that slaves benefited from the institution of, that Africans benefited from the institution of slavery, and so forth. We were on a family vacation one time, and we have, Brenda, my wife has family in Paducah, Kentucky, a lovely little river town in western Kentucky, right on the banks of the Ohio. There's a lot of kind of stuff. And so I'm standing on the banks of the Ohio, looking across to Illinois, and I am thinking Uncle Tom's Cabin, because this is like the ice flow. If you can cross the Ohio, you're free. That's what Jim is trying to do in Uncle Tom, in Huck Finn. In Huck Finn, he wants the raft to go up the Ohio, not keep going down the Mississippi. Mark Twain doesn't know what to do with this novel, so he just has them float past it in a fog bank one night. It's like, you're really not committed to this plot at all. I'm not sure what you're doing. But anyway, so I'm thinking, I'm looking at that, and we were with a family friend who was there with his son who made that claim. Like he said, he's a wonderful Christian guy, said to his son, most of the slaves were happy. And I'm thinking, family vacation, not really, what do I do? And so I just simply asked the question, how would we know that? How would you even know if they were happy or not? It's like, well, you'd have to ask them, I guess. And if you ask them in the presence of their master, they're probably going to say, oh yeah, we're happy, right? Because they know the consequences of saying no. But this plantation culture, you see it all throughout American culture. Songs of Stephen Foster, when the monuments go up Civil War monuments do not go up right after the Civil War. They go up in the 1880s and 1890s. Right. And you see it in a lot of literature from the time. This recasting of plantation life as kind of calm and paternalistic, but not oppressive, right? Doesn't account for the incredible degree of sexual abuse that enslaved black women faced, which we know because all you have to do is look at the genetic makeup of people who are descended from enslaved people. It's not all African. Okay. So this is the time then that reconciliation between the white Northerners and white Southerners, most of whom were Protestant Christians, at the expense of the full citizenship rights of blacks, recasts the providential nature of America, the understanding of America as a chosen land, as a providential, as a land that has a particular role to play in God's working in history. And that's where it becomes a particularly racialized identity, because they just never really address the question of, is there a way of articulating the promise of America in a providential way that includes black citizens? Right? It's simply not part of the conversation, which I find kind of really, really interesting. Stan.
Two comments. One of the readings that I came across recently, sort of trying to further delve into this particular subject, had an interesting point about reminding me about Nikki Haley's discussion at her debate, several months, whatever it was, a while, when she was asked about, the Civil War, and it was caused by states' rights arguments as opposed to racism of some sort, and that that was an argument that went along exactly with another article that I found in a place called Restorative Faith. It was just an article that I thought, and it was about Christian nationalism, how evangelical Christianity became a political religion. And what I was kind of interested in is the issue of remaking a myth to be okay that we are, quote, still Christian, albeit we are slave-owning, racist Christians.
Yeah.
And I thought that was
Yeah.
an interesting issue, and that she, in this instance, Nikki Haley and so many others of that particular persuasion, allowed that argument to support a continuing set of values that seem to be so inconsistent with
Yeah.
Christianity. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
this is an interesting article in a strict place I would never have ordinarily found it, but I fumbled around and I found this. And
Yeah.
it was,
Yeah. What I think is interesting, Stan, is that for a long time, historians and political scientists have looked at the 1980s and the rise of the moral majority and Reagan's 2 terms as president as the moment when evangelicals become political, right? And I think that our current moment, 21st century experience, is forcing people to say, well, maybe we should look back a little further and recognize that if you focus on kind of an American identity and a kind of a Christian American identity, then evangelicals have been political for much longer than the rise of the moral majority. It just takes on a particular cast. The politics kind of keeps changing, which again, and this is, I think, what leads me to these 2 questions I've been pondering. But we'll get to, yeah, Stan.
one more thing to that
Yeah.
is that I happened to come across an article just very recently. It was in the New York Times, and it happened to be about a variation on what you spoke of last week about a history of sermons having, almost a prophetic statement, a declination of some sort, and then a solution that brought us back. So the circle kept going, and that the article was speaking about how one current political person, that happened to be John Ossoff, that his speeches are ostensibly in the same format.
Oh, yeah.
And that they are very clearly two parts with a resolution. And I thought that was fascinating. It
Yeah.
was
All the speeches.
This is not, yeah,
They're all like that.
this rhetorical structure is not simply in the hands of conservative right-leaning Americans. Left-leaning Americans use the same. They just start with a different promise.
Yeah. And, the lost cause, I think it could be argued that the Civil Wars never really ended. That as soon as they undid the Voting Rights Act, the South went right back to districting, gerrymandering to exclude blacks.
I think that's what's the troubling thing for a lot of people about the Supreme Court decision to no longer enforce the Voting Rights Act. It's like, you really think we're past this? And the speed at which some states started redrawing maps would suggest that, I'm not sure we're really committed to one person, one vote across the board.
They threw out elections that were in process.
There's a good book called The Evangelicals, and I cannot remember at the moment who wrote it, but it's a good history of the whole movement, and it way back in the beginning. And the thing that has always struck me as how do you not see this? The slave owners had church services that their slaves were required to attend. So they're teaching them the Bible, or some parts of it, and at the same time they're enslaving them and maltreating them.
Yeah.
Sounds like double think.
Yeah, how do you do that?
Well, and it's also, why would you do it? The other question would be, why would you do it? Because if you put the Bible stories in the hands of enslaved people, you may tell them all you want, focus on Paul, focus on slaves obey your masters. Yeah. They're going to find they're going to find the Exodus story, and they're going to and this is.
They weren't allowed to read.
Except they still learn the Exodus story, right? Because it's all through Negro spirituals.
Which were also used as
Guidance for the
guidance
escaping.
and this is how
Yeah.
you do it, this is when it's okay.
Yeah, yeah. That's a fascinating history.
It was also very selective
Oh, yeah.
preaching.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that wasn't, everything's up, and here's what, be a good servant,
Right.
obey your master. That was the kind of
Yeah.
sermons they were getting.
But and this is a hard history to research and write, because you have to rely on a lot of folk oral history and so forth. But there's been enough of that now to know that slave preachers preached one set of sermons when they were in the presence of the master, and another set of sermons when they were not. Because there's no other way to explain how certain kind of ideas got into spirituals, so forth. Yeah, but it's a complicated story. But I guess for me, the kind of big takeaway for our conversation is that coming out of the Civil War, that reconciliation between Northern whites and Southern whites is accomplished and can become then a different kind of providential narrative. That once again, we're a favored nation of God who is now using us again to accomplish his purposes. And in part it's because but again, that articulation of it does not include full civil rights for black citizens, at least once the federal government removes itself from the conversation. I came across a quotation from William Lloyd Garrison, one of the leading abolitionists, probably the biggest voice, who was, this is in a letter to a friend, and the friend, they were talking about establishing a memorial for kind of like, we've made it through the Civil War, and his friend writes to him and says, I'm thinking that the inscription for this memorial should be from 1 Samuel 7:12, which is about like, it uses the phrase the Ebenezer. Here we establish an Ebenezer, thus far God has led us. Did you grow up singing Come Thou Fount, that great gospel song? And I remember as a kid thinking,
What's that?
we said, kind of joyfully singing, here I raise my Ebenezer. It's like, what in the world are we singing about? I think it's the only thing in the hymnal I grew up with had a footnote. It was the only footnote in the whole hymnal to explain what an Ebenezer was. And this is what Garrison wrote back to his friend. I object to this phraseology because it seems to imply that the Lord has a deeper concern for American interests than he has for those of any other people outside our territorial limits. It's like, just like completely step away from historical providentialism. And I think that would be a radical statement to make today. That would be a controversial statement for a lot of American Christians today. And this is 1876, because they're establishing like this monument for the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. And Garrison saying, no, you don't want to claim that God has led us to this point, because it suggests that God cares more about us than he does about other nations.
And also, he's an abolitionist. He's realizing our cause has really failed.
Well, and I think that's true. It's like, yeah, if God was really on our side, we wouldn't be having this, things would have turned out differently. The other really interesting voice for me in this is Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote an essay for The Atlantic in the midst of the Civil War that the editors published because he was Nathaniel Hawthorne, and they was kind of like prominent enough that they wanted to publish it, and then basically said, we don't agree with anything Nathaniel just wrote, because he basically saying, this is not going to accomplish what it set out to accomplish. Like no human endeavor ever accomplishes what it sets out to accomplish. The good we do incidentally. This is the same guy who opens the Scarlet Letter, which is set among those first generation of Puritans who were with Winthrop on board the Arbella, and says, like, no matter what utopian community human beings might envision, they're going to end up building a cemetery and a jail. Right? And this is Hawthorne's kind of like undercutting of the kind of the providential narrative of that. And it's out of that jail that Hester Prynne steps, who was with the first boatload of Puritans, fictionally, who has become pregnant even though her husband's not in the colony at the time. If you only read Scarlet Letter in high school, read it again sometime. There are some times when it's like, could I just give America a reading assignment? Like, could we just all take a couple weeks and read the Scarlet Letter and talk about the hypocrisy of and the intricate balance between individual expression and communal kind of communal norms. It's fascinating.
Disenfranchisement of a huge swath of the population.
Yeah. Anyway, so here are my two questions that I've been pondering.
51%.
Why, in moments of stress, has it not been enough to say, if you agree with the Constitution, if you agree with the Declaration, you're an American?
Because you interpret it differently. That's right. The Second Amendment, which, why they put that in, I don't know.
Yeah, or at least could it, it's just not well written either. The Second Amendment is just not clearly written, unfortunately. Yeah, partly it is different interpretation. Right? But there's some, I think, Lemby, that there are some moments when it's like, it doesn't matter how much you say you agree with the Constitution and the Declaration, you're not a real American.
Well, there's, times of stress can produce more unity as well.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if you're attacked as a nation, then maybe all your subgroups are suddenly, there to help you. But it seems like it's not during that kind of stress, it's the aftermath of that,
Okay.
where people begin to look at the divisions.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the internment of Japanese Americans on the West Coast had nothing at all to do with whether they embraced the principles of the Declaration and the Bill of Rights.
They look different.
It was purely,
And they didn't do it with the Germans.
yeah,
Right.
Or the Italian.
yeah.
So there you go. Yeah, it's just racism.
So there's that it's like, that seems to be part of it. Other thoughts, like why, in these moments, whether it's during the time of war or after war, that we've tended as a nation to be willing to say, you're not really part of us. Fear? But fear of,
Not having enough.
okay,
If there's enough for all, everyone, there might not be enough for me.
okay. And so let's find a scapegoat, let's find a group to scapegoat.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's pretend for a minute that the differences are really about class. It's really about people who are poor and people who have not. The rich always try to divide the poor along racial lines or whatever.
Yeah. I'm just fascinated by, I remember getting really interested in post-World War II American culture at one point and doing a lot of study and like coming across this House Un-American Activities Committee. And at first I just kind of took it for granted. It's like, oh, this is really interesting. But then I just thought like, to claim that there is such a thing as an un-American activity, you must have some kind of at least functional definition of what an American activity is and what the kind of the boundaries are.
Right.
Right?
An American activity is whatever I do. And anything you do that's not like that is American.
And this is exactly what people then who were called to testify before Congress, because a lot of the people called to testify in front of either the Senate or the House committee had not broken any laws.
Right. Of course not.
But they had done something that power structures at the time defined as un-American.
Right.
And many of them said, no, I was doing exactly an American thing.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of fear of communism.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that a little bit next week, where if we talk about more contemporary forms of this, Cold War is another point of real stress. War on terror is a time, again, of tremendous stress, where it doesn't seem to be enough, where the question is like, who really is the heart of the nation, really comes in, that becomes part of the conversation again.
And that fear that, the Cold War, the war on terror, that fear that we have leads us to act in ways that are so un-American. like we just give away all our values because we're scared. Okay, government, go ahead, read all my emails, listen in on my phone calls, no problem, You might catch a terror plot in the making if you listen listen closely enough to everybody.
Okay. I had a colleague who announced to a fairly large group of students that one time at a ball game he didn't stand up for the national anthem. And oh my goodness, this was a flashpoint for a lot of students. It's like, how dare you, da-da-da-da-da. And I was kind of in a role of trying to talk with some students who were upset about what my colleague had said. And one of the things I tried to point out to one of them who was from a very, for many of them it was because they were from military families. And they interpreted it as not standing up for the national anthem as a disrespect for the people who died in service to their country. I mean, they went that there's a lot of mid-steps, why exactly do we sing the national anthem at baseball games? We don't do it at the start of the symphony, we don't do it at the start of movies, why exactly do we here? So it's really, but anyway, that kind of I didn't try to get there with the student. I was just here's an irony. The very things that you say your family fought to defend, one of the things your family fought to defend was his right not to stand up.
That's right.
And he kind of went, yeah, that makes me uncomfortable. I don't really like that. It's well, but that's right. One of the things that you're defending is the right to freedom of speech.
Right.
Freedom of expression. And that has to, I think, kind of leave room for someone who's going to express something that you don't like. But that's that kind of cognitive dissonance. That's what I kept coming back to. It's I think one reason why is that if we have fellow citizens who cause us cognitive dissonance by acting as American citizens in ways that are uncomfortable to us, one of the easiest ways to kind of write it off is they must not be real Americans. If they were real Americans, they wouldn't be doing that. And this is what becomes so difficult to be held together by those set of ideas. Because those set of ideas can be interpreted in different ways, and to allow space for the people who live out those ideals differently than I do is kind of to put stress on that sense of what it even means to be an American.
Are we the first country to be based on ideals rather than, just that we're there?
Yeah,
if I'm born in Sweden, I'm Swedish.
Yeah. I think the English would probably say, no, you're not. No, we're not. No, we're not. But because the Magna Carta, you have parliamentary monarchy. Which is why, again, if we go back, why members of the revolutionary generation could say, I'm not being anti-English, I'm being English. I'm rebelling against Parliament because I'm English, not because I don't want to be English. So I think they would say, but this is part of what it means to be a modern nation state, is to be bound together, as one scholar calls it, an imagined community. That we imagine that we're all on the same page, commitment to certain ideals.
Yeah, but in terms of religion, We have the Establishment Clause, which says that Congress cannot establish a religion, and we have the Free Exercise Clause, which says basically you cannot interfere with people's religion. So basically, those were the founding principles,
Yeah.
and we get away from them, but that's kind of it.
And
And
we're
so
a
this
Christian nation because the people in the 1700s who founded us were basically Christians. I mean, they had different ideas of Christianity, but they weren't Muslim, they weren't Jewish.
Yeah,
they-
they were Christian in the sense that they're not Muslim, they're not Jewish, they're not, Buddhist. But they're also profoundly influenced by the Enlightenment thought, which has lots of influences beyond Christian faith. So much so that Thomas Jefferson had a personal copy of the Bible that he cut out all the miracles,
Right.
including the resurrection. So he maintains this sense of like a deistic understanding of faith, that God exists, God created, and then kind of let the thing run on its own, which is much more of an Enlightenment thought than it is a Christian thought. So that's, do you see the, here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that if we're a society held together by ideas, at points of stress where those like, we're starting to see some fraying, like it's almost like let's kind of cohere around a certain interpretation of those ideas. And if that means building some scapegoats, whether they're from another country or from our own country, and if we're honest about it, brown-skinned people have more frequently than white-skinned people been identified as the outlier here. And again, if you go back to the congressional record, there's lots of a conversation about whether or not people from China can be democratic, can adapt to a democratic society. One of the reasons why when the United States is ceded the Philippines from Spain, that they do not give the Philippines independence immediately, is that the president claims that God appeared to him basically in a vision and said they're not ready for self-government yet. They need your help. It's like, okay, how long are we going to help them before they have a chance to for self-government? Yeah, that's all. It's like we haven't got to the point of Spain's colonial presence, but so there's all of that kind of talk as well.
That whole thing about the deists and everything and saying, God created and then left for a while, reminds me of an old poem that God made the world in 6 days flat, and on the 7th he said, I'll rest. So he let the thing into orbit swing to give it a dry run test. Billion years or so went by. When he took a look at the whirling blob, his spirits fell as he shrugged, oh well, it was only a 6-day job.
It's like, oh, yeah. Why do we have the world that we have, right? Here's the question. And the second question I've been pondering is, why are Christians in America so prone at points of stress to kind of come back to this idea of we were meant to be a Christian nation, whatever they mean by that?
Isn't that really about control? Because as much as we fear, we desire control. And so if we can say, well, let everything else go, this is the one thing that we can all get behind, and so let's pour our efforts into that because we want to control the chaos, which we cannot. But then when that crisis or that moment has passed, then we can kind of go back to the other things that are still there, but that we have maybe shed for a moment.
Okay, interesting.
Another angle would be maybe we really have a yearning for a spiritual aspect to life. And in times of trouble, we emphasize that more. The problem is when you say my spirituality is a lot better than yours.
And I think it's also then back tied into that national providentialism, the sense of like, do we do we believe that one of the things that sets us apart is that we've been given a mission by God to accomplish in the world? And if we're not a godly people, how are we going to accomplish a godly mission in the world?
But at the same time, church attendance is down, fewer and fewer people identify themselves as religious.
Yeah. The other thing I'm thinking, and I wish I knew more about psychology than I do, but I'm also thinking that my religious identity goes really, really deep. And if I feel tension between for me, Christian identity, my identity as a disciple of Jesus, and my identity as an American, if I'm feeling kind of tension between those two understandings of myself, one of the things that's going to be tempting to do is to collapse them into the same. And here's the other thing: it's like if that's a tendency to kind of fall back to my most fundamental identity and collapse all of my other identities into that most fundamental identity. And if I'm a Christian, I'm going to likely kind of, well, it must be a Christian nation because I'm a Christian living in this nation and I want it to be. Right? I must be a Christian husband, father, whatever, because I'm a Christian and I want that to be kind of. But if that's the case, then it also makes it really convenient for politicians to manipulate our most fundamental identity. Right, to say, if you're really Christian, no, let me rephrase that. This is a righteous cause. The cause I'm identifying is a righteous cause. So as a Christian, you should get on board with it. And it's like, well, yeah, I want to be part of a righteous cause. We certainly, if you go back to the sermons preached, at least before every war up to Vietnam, it was very much like, right, this is the war to make the world safe for democracy. Right. And then this, and it doesn't, and again, I'm not saying that those causes are not righteous or not just in some sense of that word. I'm not saying that we should not have opposed fascism throughout Europe, right? But to make that part of God's cause makes it then much more difficult for Christians to offer a prophetic voice to any aspect of it.
Do you think that the issue, you started to say a little bit earlier, and I started to comment on it when you were talking about writers and others, before us and us, of course, saying, if I'm a Christian and I want us to be that, and I want, that's a desire that's inculcated in us through experience of some sort. So how did that want part become consistent or inconsistent with our enlightenment awareness? It seems to me that conflict is the driving force, because the issue in all those things is I want it to be, because that is the thing that seems to be that which can be most easily preyed upon, as we were just discussing.
Yeah.
So I think that word, that desire, want, how is it that we want that, as opposed to we want something else about human equity, inclusiveness, etc. All those things that are due to others as we would want us to be done to us, etc. Yeah. That seems to be in conflict with those aspirational qualities of the Enlightenment that sort of was part of the readings of all of our quote-unquote founders, which seems to be that which has been manipulated away by how they phrase it? I'm just going to say the political religion, the evangelical political religion that we experience so much now that it's hard for me, to separate out from that which we might have learned in, I'm older than you, than in the 50s.
Yeah. Yeah, that's.
Does that ring at all?
I think so. I'm trying to track with what you're saying.
There seems to be the issue of we want something, but how is it that we have become so desirous of wanting a particular resolution than being expansive about including others?
Yeah, I see. Yeah, here's another piece that I think it plays a factor here. If you have people who perceive that in the American past, people like me were at the center of the culture. And something has happened and we're no longer at the center of the culture.
Right.
Then you're much more likely to respond to a call that says you can once again be the center of the culture. If the culture comes back, then you'll be where you should. And the interesting thing is that, first of all, I'm not sure, depending on how Marxist you want to get in all of this, that such people were ever the center of the culture. That capitalists were the center of the culture and had been the center of the culture from the beginning. So, but you do have that sense. And it's a legitimate sense. I mean, you know, the reason there are so many Catholic private schools is not because Catholic immigrants felt as though the public schools were too secular. It's because they felt the public schools were too Protestant. I mean, that was like, we don't want to send our kids to public school because we want them to be good Catholics.
Right.
They weren't concerned about like secularized, they were concerned about losing their Catholic faith.
Yeah.
So the earliest renditions of Catholic private high school education was about maintaining Catholic belief.
Right.
So there's that sense, so there is that sense of like the culture was in some broad sense Protestant in the 19th century, but I'm not sure that means they were particularly Christian in terms of like enacting the teachings of Jesus, right? Because I've seen calls to put the Ten Commandments up in courtrooms, but I've never seen a call to put the Beatitudes up in a courtroom. You don't really get that. That would really mess with your system. Like, how are you going to develop laws around this? But I also think that it is a weak ecclesiology that we have Americans with a free church kind of movement and without a state church, we do not have a strong sense of the church is the center of my life. If the church is the center of my life, then my responsibilities as a citizen kind of skirt around the edges of this. But if the church isn't the center, or if the church that is the center of your life has been so kind of mixed with civil religion that Mother's Day and Father's Day and 4th of July and Memorial Day and Veterans Day are more part of the church calendar than Lent, you know, and Easter, right? Then you really are in a situation where that kind of civil religion is. I realize I probably should define that term. In the 1960s, a sociologist by the name of Robert Bellah looked around at American kind of public life and argued that in addition to church, religious faith, and so forth, there was also what he called American civil religion that borrowed the language of Christianity, but that served a broader function in the culture than just providing meaning for Christians. And in reading his work, I can realize, like, yeah, I could look at the church for centuries has had a liturgical calendar. But again, I grew up in a church where, if I'm really honest about it, the big days at church were not part of the traditional Christian calendar. They were Mother's Day Sunday and Father's Day Sunday. And 4th of July and Veterans Day. Like, what are the kind of the high points of the year at church? Okay. And that is what Bellah argues was part of civil religion. And if you think about that too, it's like he also then pointed out that we have sacred spaces in America that may again borrow kind of from Christian faith in some way, but are not. Can you think of what are some American sacred spaces?
Lincoln Memorial.
Lincoln Memorial. Vietnam Memorial. Mount Rushmore. Right. The battlefield at Gettysburg. right? That's what it's like. Yeah, that's the place in the civil religion. That's where people. That's the places to where people make pilgrimages. And so what is confusing is that Bella argues that this civil religion borrows a lot of the language of Christian faith. I remember hearing George W. Bush make a speech one time where he's talking about the sacrifice of soldiers. And he used the phrase that in the blood shed by soldiers, there is power in that blood. And that blood will never lose its power. And I just like thinking, oh my goodness, what are you saying? Like, to me, that was like, you just crossed a line, because that sacrificial blood is the blood of Christ. That's the sacrificial blood. But we use it all the time, don't we? We talk about people who die in service to their nation as having made the ultimate sacrifice. Well, that's borrowed from Christian gospel. Jesus made the ultimate sacrifice on the cross.
But that's all by design. I don't think it was his
No.
initial thought. There are architects behind that.
Oh yeah. First of all, that's when I realized, it's like, there is a speechwriter here, and I don't think that was a phrase. That's I think one of the things that bothered me about that when I heard that speech is like, I think that somebody knew what they were doing. Sure. Who wrote that speech knew exactly. It's like, and this is like to me it was drawing Christian people into this cause by equating the sacrifice of soldiers with the sacrifice of Christ. Yeah. And to me, that is where the church loses any kind of sense of offering a prophetic voice. If we are that close to the culture. If we're that close to the culture, how do you even say, for all the good we've done, we might want to work on this? Right. That, yes, we need to fight this war. But right, I also was thinking this week about how infrequently the American military has been called upon to defend American territory. Right? Yes. Wow, there are very few times in our history when we've been called upon to defend American territory.
Two large oceans.
We have often, though, the military has been sent to places to defend the American way of life, which is such a vague term. It's like we never really get a chance to define what is that you're defending.
As in the Marines going to the Barbary Coast to defend missionaries.
Yeah, or to defend banana plantations, right? Or like any other number of things, right? It's like, well, who gets to decide? Or this one, like, this is a war to defend American interests. It's like, well, we never really have that debate about what American interests are.
Well, currently we don't have a debate at all. But,
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't it really about, I mean, if we boil it down, isn't it about capitalism?
Yeah.
I didn't say that. But that's like, this is like, and we can come back to that original Jeremiah structure, where some historians argued the promise of America was democracy, capitalism messed things up. If we modify capitalism, then and then other later historians said, no, the real promise was this mixture of capitalism and democracy. And socialism's the threat, right? And so there is this question, because it does seem to me that we live in a society that our political structures say everybody's equal, and our economic structures say make yourself unequal as much as you can. And so there is, at least it would be nice if we acknowledge that there's a tension there between our democratic structures politically and our economic structures, which are about kind of rising above other people. Maybe it's a healthy tension, but it's a tension.
But is it about the belief that there's finite goods or finite resources?
Right.
And I need to have as much as I can to preserve my way of life, not the way of life.
Do you need it? But do you need $1 trillion to do that this week? Oh my word, right? And there was I think this may have been a New York Times article that said the title was "How much of Elon Musk's money was helped by government contracts?" And the subtitle was "All of it," right? That all of it, like we're underwriting this. And so, but it becomes really, really difficult. Again, from a Christian perspective, how do you counter that growing inequity between the wealthiest Americans and the rest of us in ways that does not sound anti-American? Right. Well, one way is that you separate out the nation's project and the Christian message. But we are in a time when that's not exactly, we're out of time, shared. One of the things I'd like to do next week, and this will be the last session before we kind of split for the summer and then decide what to do in the fall, but is to try to let you know a little bit about kind of the current forms that Christian nationalism is taking. One of which is, I think it's called the Seven Mountain Theory, where this notion that Christians need to get involved in every aspect of American culture and kind of rise to prominence in every aspect of American culture. And so this is a model that says that Christians will be a Christian nation if Christians kind of assume leadership throughout the culture, rather than no, we stand outside here as a community. We stand out here as a community of faith. We may be involved. I've got a colleague who teaches journalism at the college who has for a long time said, we don't exist, at Christian college, we don't exist to educate Christian journalists. Our program exists to educate journalists who are Christian. And I think that's an interesting distinction. So, thank you. This has really been an interesting conversation. And we'll do one more session next week.